We are now recording. My name is Will Hull, and this will be the California wild card for Division D, hearing for the We the People National Finals. In a moment, I'll have the judges introduce themselves, followed by the students, and then we will begin the hearing. Students will have a 4-minute prepared statement, followed by 8 minutes of judge follow-up questions. My microphone will be muted during the hearing. However, I will be holding up the 1 minute as well as the time signs, just so that you're aware during the period of the hearing. I suggest also, to be able to see that you change your view inside of Zoom into a gallery view. It's in the top right-hand corner where you can click on that so you can see everyone. And at the conclusion of the hearing, the judges will also give brief feedback to your team, and then we will conclude the hearing. At this point in time, I'm going to allow the judges to introduce themselves to begin.
Good afternoon. My name is Julie Silverbrook. I am the Senior Director of Partnerships and Constitutional Scholar in Residence at iCivics. Now I invite my colleagues to go ahead and introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Tim Igo. I am a lawyer, writer, and magazine editor at the State Bar of Arizona in Phoenix, Arizona.
I'm Nick Drummond. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Black Hills State University in South Dakota.
Now you guys can go ahead and introduce yourselves to us.
Good afternoon. We are Foothill High School's Unit 2, representing the state of California and the city of Pleasanton. My name is Ananya Kutikad.
My name is Sanjana Dukopati.
My name is Charlotte Zander.
And my name is Ted Kim. We would like to thank the judges, the audience, and the timekeeper for being here today, as well as each of the coaches, Mr. McBride, Mr. Dedamore, and Mr. Constantelos.
Wonderful. I will now let you know that you are going to be answering question 1 this afternoon, which I will now read to you in full. What were the major disagreements among the 55 delegates during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and how were they resolved? What issues, if any, were not resolved, and what were the consequences? What changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? You may begin when you're ready.
If the Constitution were a rocket, then the framers were the engineers, assembling their views to produce a document capable of taking the nation to the moon. This task did not come without arguments between the nation's engineers themselves. Delegates disagreed on several issues, but the most intense arguments revolved around representation in Congress and the proposed constitutional negative.
As James Madison mused, the convention's great difficulty lies in representation. Hugh Williamson of North Carolina accused small states of attempting to take over the federal government through equal representation. Small state delegates fiercely fought back. Gunning Bedford Jr. of Delaware even warned the convention that small states will find some foreign ally who will take them by the hand and do them justice. With the fledgling nation at risk of dissolving, large states begrudgingly agreed to the Connecticut Compromise, creating a proportional House of Representatives and an equal Senate.
Another disagreement was over the original Virginia plan's constitutional negative, which would have allowed Congress to veto state laws. James Madison believed this provision would protect the national government from the states and the states from each other. However, delegates such as Elbridge Gerry claimed this veto would enslave the states to the national government. While the constitutional negative did not survive in its original form, the sentiment prevailed through the Supremacy Clause in Article 6.
Although the framers' rocket had a successful takeoff, its engineers failed to resolve the key issues of slavery and voting, veering the nation off course. While some delegates, like Gouverneur Morris, condemned slavery, the convention chose to appease the South through the 3/5 compromise. The convention's approach to this issue set a precedent of compromising over slavery at the national level, dooming America to regional conflict and ultimately the Civil War.
The lack of true resolution to slavery was expected, given the South's vehement pro-slavery position at the convention. South Carolina Governor Rawlins Lowndes even stated in 1788 that without slaves, this state would degenerate into the most contemptible in the Union. Governor Lowndes sent 4 wealthy plantation owners to Philadelphia, who would ardently defend the institution to support their lavish livelihoods.
While slavery remained unresolved despite its prominence at the convention, the delegates simply did not consider voting qualification in great detail. Though the framers discussed the merits of property requirements for voting, the convention decided to delegate the House's voting qualifications to the states in Article 1, Section 2, leaving the unamended Constitution utterly without protections for voting. Ultimately, these unfinished debates surrounding slavery and voting left the country without a national standard of citizenship until the Reconstruction.
Today, our constitutional rocket is facing a crisis. It has given an increasingly small minority a death grip over the political process, as seen in our broken Senate and amendment process, both tied excessively to the states. Equal representation in the Senate contradicts our Republican framework of government, as over half the population lives in just 9 states, according to census data from 2018. We feel the best solution to this is Professor Eric Ortz's plan for a proportional Senate, which would preserve at least 1 senator per state while reapportioning the remaining 50 seats.
Still, change is unlikely unless we fix our amendment process. Article 5 grants an extremely small minority the power to block even the most beneficial amendments. Patrick Henry pointed this out at the 1788 Virginia Ratification Convention, claiming that 5% of the national population could block an amendment. Today, that number is closer to 2%. One way to address this is by creating an alternative ratification path that bypasses the states by ratifying amendments through a 2/3 national popular vote. This would place ratification in the hands of the people, shifting power away from the states. On the other hand, we believe the congressional proposal process should be retained in combination with the Orth Senate plan.
The convention did not necessarily produce effective constitutional provisions. The smallest of founding era miscalculations may be causing irreversible damage to our rocket, and we must adapt our national document to address them. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to pick up on, you have really sort of wove this through all of your arguments, which is the sense that you feel that power ought to be shifted away from the states and toward the national government. And you put out a proposal to change how the Senate is apportioned. So you'd have 1 senator per state, and then you would have proportional representation. And was wondering if you could go into detail about why the convention delegates originally designed the Senate for equal representation, and then pre-17th Amendment, why senators were chosen by state legislatures and not directly by the citizens of those states.
To address the first part of the question, well, back then they were selected, or there was equal representation within the Senate because they wanted they wanted to appease the South and make sure that they still had the ability to have representation within one house of the legislature. And back then we have to understand that the population demographic was about 12-1 from large states to small states. So this was feasible back then. And it did lead to a more nuanced branch of government or nuanced house. However, nowadays, that same argument is not applicable because we see that the population demographic is about 62-1 and from large states to small states. So we do need change because the same argument just isn't as applicable.
And towards the second part of your question about why pre-17th Amendment we had the state legislatures select them, I would point to Federalist 39, where James Madison basically outlines the fact that our government is both national and federal. And so in order to include the national aspect where there's representation of the people, you also have to include the federal aspect where there is representation of the states. And I think that Madison intended the Senate to be representation for the states, hence why state legislatures were the constituencies or the people who would select their own representatives towards that aspect of government.
And just to add on to the first part of the question, the equal representation was sort of the norm for the time, as under the Articles of Confederation, each state had only 1 representative in their legislative branch. And so this equal representation, a lot of the small states felt if they took that aspect of government away from them, they were going to lose out. It was going to be a giant shift. And so these smaller states were actually scared that they were getting the worst end of the stick, and that they were losing something that they had under the Articles of Confederation. And so the small states kind of fought for this, and that's why they ended up getting equal representation.
Thank you.
So if I could, it sounds like you would say that ultimately the small states succeeded in taking over the federal government through representation. And if that's the case, I'm curious whether you would draw a line, and that started through a compromise about essentially slavery. So would you think it's too much then to draw a line to modern day where the small states have outsized power, and that affects primarily people of color in more urban and dense states.
We can definitely see the effects of the Connecticut Compromise, especially today. As my unit mate previously mentioned, the ratio between the populations of the largest state, Virginia, and the small state of Delaware was 12-1. But today we see that the population ratio has shifted to about 67-1. So we can, and that reflects California and Wyoming respectively. So we can see that these rural interests definitely have definitely stronger power within the Senate over the urban interests. And this is definitely something that is persisting an even worse issue that we see today.
I think also in terms of the fact that the population demographic has shifted in the sense that what was once around 30,000 people per constituency is now around 700,000 on average for the House. We see that there is this kind of shift in idea because each constituency has to be held within state lines by our current system. So I would say that in terms of states like California compared to other states like Wyoming, having to enclose each district within that specific state line means that there is kind of less people will have more representation if there are less people in their constituency because they're being represented comparatively more than people in larger districts.
Thank you.
Maybe switch gears here. One of the major points of contention at the convention, and certainly thereafter during the great debate that occurred in the newspapers, was about the appropriate size of a republic. Can you say something about this particular debate? What were the major disagreements and what side of the debate do you support and why?
So in Federalist 10, Hamilton talks, James Madison talks about the large republic and how the large republic would be able to effectively curb a large majority from a small majority from imposing its will. And by having these multiple small factions competing with each other, a large republic will be able to effectively protect minorities. And this is definitely one of the prevalent remarks of the Federalists during the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debates.
But to counteract that, at the same time, anti-federalists like Brutus in Brutus I brought up the argument that it would be extremely difficult to govern a large republic and argued that the Constitution was dissolving state sovereignty into one large republic, even saying that 13 states into one government would lead to the destruction of your liberties. So as a result, this was definitely one of the prevalent arguments of the anti-federalist campaigns. And personally, I think that it was very valid coming from the Articles of Confederation, coming from the Revolutionary War. People were very scared that their liberties were going to be taken away and were trying to hold on to them, especially when this convention seemed much like a coup for the general public at that time.
Yeah, I think that's a nice segue into the question of the Bill of Rights. I mean, this was certainly another point of contention. What can you say about that debate? Why would someone oppose the Bill of Rights as Madison and Hamilton did? At least Madison did initially. Why would they possibly be opposed to that?
Well, in Federalist 84, Hamilton outlines this idea that enumeration is elimination, as that is what they did with Congress in Article 1, Section 8. They had pretty much outlined their powers, and by outlining their powers, they implied that the other powers not listed were not accessible to Congress. And so I would say that in this perspective, if we look at the Bill of Rights, Hamilton and Madison truly feared that by enumerating rights, they wouldn't, the other rights that were not listed would not be applicable to the American people, and there wouldn't be a mechanism to do so. However, I would say that the Ninth Amendment, which was proposed after ratification, or during ratification in order to appease states into ratifying the Constitution, I would say that let me finish my thought.
Go ahead and finish your thought. Yep.
I would say that alleviated those fears. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. You guys did a great job. I will take a couple of minutes to just provide some constructive feedback. So I thought you did a nice job of taking us through two central points of contention during the convention, questions of representation, and questions of slavery, and discussing sort of how the unfinished debates over slavery and voting still have resonance and consequence today. I would have loved for you to dive a little bit deeper given that you teed that up, into what the modern concerns over voting rights are in 2021. I also thought your proposal for reform would be to shift more power away from the states, and I think that's a really unique argument, and would really kind of be a sort of a wholesale shift in the federal design of the Constitution. And I would have loved to hear from you guys a little bit more in terms of what was driving your decision making in making that proposal. But overall, I think you worked really well together as a team. You always built on each other's arguments, which shows, a real respect for one another, but also that you're all equally prepared to answer the questions. And I did think you did a nice job citing primary sources throughout your answers to the questions, which of course you did without notes, which I thought was very impressive. I'll now invite my colleagues to provide some feedback as well.
I would agree with all that. I thought it was an excellent presentation and conversation, and it was so strong that it felt like a conversation. So that's exactly what we should be going for, and you succeeded at that. Your depth of knowledge is impressive. And in fact, anything I'm going to say now is almost ridiculous because your 8 minutes was so packed. Me saying that I would love to hear more, as Julie said, about voting rights today, since that's as recent as 60 seconds ago, would be fascinating. It would communicate to us what you clearly have, but an understanding of how the failure of the founders to address slavery in any kind of effective way continues to play out today in numerous ways, including the voting rights conversation. I think there's also something to be said when you talk about representation about, let's talk about DC statehood. It's almost like we've got a little experiment going on before our eyes right now about what people think representation should be. And I'd like to think that the arguments you're hearing on both sides are different than they were 300 years ago. Guess what? They're identical. So that's where we are. So very well done. And I have to add, although it's not a writing competition, the writing was very, very good. I appreciated the rocket metaphor. And that can win or that can lose, but you committed to it and it carried you all the way through, and you landed it well. So thank you so much.
I also endorse the rocket ship. Well done with that. Opening remarks were great. The Q&A, I thought you fielded extremely well. The question about the Bill of Rights, I thought you crushed it. Excellent job. The question about the size of the Republic, I really like that you knew both sides of the debate. I've asked this question multiple times today, and I want to say that you're one of the few teams that did understand both sides of the debate. The only thing that maybe you could have added was the concern about civic virtue expressed by the Anti-Federalists. But setting that aside, I thought, well done. So outstanding.